Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next in the series of AI and Democracy webinars. I'm so pleased to introduce Tracy Brown today. And before we get started, as you know, the community has a thriving AI and Democracy WhatsApp group, which I'll put in the chat. Feel free to join and share it with anyone who would be interested. And these webinars are hosted by the UK Democracy Network and Antiparty. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. So a little bit about your hosts. Antiparty is a pro-democracy movement born from the Partygate scandal, looking to transcend the two-party system by applying collective intelligence for systems change. We want to empower individuals to collectively contribute towards positive change and restore hope by reimagining a system that works for us and not those in power. Through a combination of art and creativity, experience and expertise, we seek to inspire new solutions to old problems. The Democracy Network works to strengthen the relationships and the connections between organisations, projects and individuals working to build a healthier democracy in the UK. My name is Bella Roberts, I'm the founder of Antiparty, and I'm pleased to introduce Tracy Brown, OBE, the Director of Sense About Science. Tracy has been the Director of Sense About Science, or SAS, since 2002. Under her leadership, the charity has turned the case for sound science and evidence into popular campaigns to urge scientific thinking among the public and the people who to answer to them. It has launched important initiatives to expand and protect honest discussions of evidence, including All Trials, a global campaign for the reporting of all clinical trial outcomes, and the Ask for Evidence campaign, which engages the public in requesting evidence for claims. It has challenged opinions and changed the behavior of governments, media, and corporations in the use of scientific evidence. Tracy initiated Evidence Week in Parliament in the UK and the International John Maddox Prize for Standing Up for Science. She leads SAS's work on the transparency of evidence used by governments in policy to ensure that the public has access to the same evidence and reasoning as decision makers, and she is a regular contributor to broadcast and print media. She was awarded an OBE in 2017 for services to science. Tracy is also an honorary professor in the Department of Science, Technology and Engineering and Public Policy at UCL. So as we dive in, I encourage everyone to briefly introduce themselves in the chat. I think there was a lot of academics in today's webinar. So please introduce yourself and what's exciting you about the topic that we're going to discuss today. And any comments and questions in the chat box. If you can use the Q&A function as well of Zoom to put in your official questions, that would be very helpful and we'll get to them as soon as we can. But without further ado, I'd love to hand over to Tracy. Thanks so much.
Isabella, thank you very much for that very comprehensive introduction. Thank you very much for that great introduction. And I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to roll something out in a broader context like this, where people's interests and people's discovery of the issues around AI and decision making and democracy and safety and accountability and all those things, people have all come at it from I think quite a number of different pathways. So it's a wonderful opportunity. I'm going to share my screen and talk you through the development of what's effectively becoming a campaign of Sense About Sciences now, and talk you through why that's happened a little bit differently to previous campaigns of ours. So if you just excuse me while I, in a clunky way, share the screen, because I'm rather...
No, I'm really interested because I think at first glance, I wasn't immediately clear on, how does this relate to AI and AI policy and responsible handover, because it's usually scientific research and evidence. So yeah, really keen to hear more.
Fantastic, good. So Sense About Science ran a campaign called All Trials, which is something that happened around 10 years ago, where a problem had beset research for some considerable time. And hang on, let me just stop that share. Okay. A problem had beset research for quite some time, which was that less than half of the clinical trials that were performed on the medicines that we use today were actually available, had been published. And as you can imagine, that was often the half that people wanted you to see. And you're talking about medicines that, people, thousands, millions of people were using. And this was a problem that had been known about in medicine for something like 20 years. And people had written very cross pieces about it in journals. They'd had sort of compacts and things from international conferences. They'd drawn together around it, but nothing had changed. Drug companies still didn't publish all their trials on the medicines that they were selling. Academics were pretty poor about doing the same thing. And we sort of couldn't believe that when people came to us in frustration at the lack of trials, the danger that this represented for patients, the fact that trials were being repeated on human subjects that had already been done, compounds were being put into people when some people somewhere else already knew that they didn't work in their target disease. And we were measuring the benefits of new drugs against old drugs where we had an overstated sense of their safety and benefit. So we were messing up the medicine of the future as well as not really understanding the medicine of the past. And we could not believe that someone somewhere wasn't fixing this. And why did it take a relatively tiny charity in the UK, we're international in our work, but why did it take us to galvanize it? And we the change. And over the course of 10 years, with hundreds of thousands of people involved, this is just a fraction of the organizations. Well, as soon as we launched the public campaign, we ended up with about 100,000 people. It ended up in something like 4 million people signed up to all trials around the world eventually, and over 1,000 organizations. And this is just a handful of them. Who got together with us. And it was no single one of these organizations' job to galvanize a response. They all had a big and important role to play in some part of the ecosystem, but it was nobody's job to take the charge and just make something practical happen. And in many cases, the reasons why trials weren't being published was not just secrecy and trying to kind of withhold less than flattering results of trials. In a lot of cases, it was because of the fact that it was just sloth. It was simply, why would you go back and find something from 8 years ago and go to the trouble of publishing it unless you were under some considerable pressure to do so, unless your institution was getting a bad reputation, was featuring low in a ranking order, that was exposing who hadn't published their trials, those kinds of things. Unless there was some pressure, why would you take that forward? And each of these organizations represents one small part of the ecosystem: the consumers, the patient groups, the different parts of medicine, the different parts of commissioning and procurement, the different health services, and so on. And here we are, I find myself looking at a relatively similar situation. And it's taken, I have to say, it's taken Sense About Science a few years to figure out when it comes to the handover of tools and tech. It's taken us some time to figure out that actually no one here is taking the charge and just making something happen in that space. So there is a big governance gap, and there is a problem, a kind of what I would call the round table problem of AI. And when I say AI, I'm just capturing up advanced data tools and tech. I mean in not any particular type of AI. I'm talking about things where people can't see inside the box without someone showing them what's inside the box. And we've been looking at this gap for some time from the perspective of people coming to us saying, how do I unpack or demystify the what I'm being offered? So I don't know how many of you are aware of this, but in our big hospitals all over the world, we are awash with model software, different AI bits of kit, and very little of this has been regulated or put through a single standard test or a standard procurement procedure or standard commissioning procedure. And lots of it's just been lobbed over the wall by developers, by people doing sort of creating what we call professorware, often well-meaning. And that's just in medicine. I mean, if you look in things like even in very, very well-meaning parts of the world, like, for example, aid agencies working with people in flood zones are using tools and tech that they themselves don't understand, and they don't know what the risk of it being wrong is when they're offering flood predictors and things like this to communities for whom the decision to move their tools and seed out up to higher ground may be one that actually loses them a whole week's work. So you've got decisions being made at the moment in many, many organizations where people are saying, well, we don't know how to unpack this. People coming to Sense About Science saying, we are very worried about the danger of things that we're creating entering into circulation as something else out of context and without all of the requisite strengths and weaknesses being communicated. And then we've got people coming to us also saying, we are the recipients of these things, and we don't know how to check whether they do what they're supposed to do. What questions are we supposed to ask? And now, about 4 or 5 years ago, we'd already seen quite a lot of this, and we created Data Science, a Guide for Society, as the beginning of figuring out what the key questions are. And that came down to 3 questions that we identified, which is, where did it come from? What are the assumptions being made? And can it bear the weight we want to put on it? And this was to start popularizing and developing a question series that ordinary people even could ask about data tools and tech. Then we started looking at what would this mean in the context that people were coming to us about, which is to say, you've got people offered a piece of kit and not knowing what questions will keep, say, my patients safe, what questions will mean that I actually uncover all the risks that are associated with this, what ways in which can I find out it's been tested as it should be. So we started to expand out those questions and to look at it from the point of view of both of these sides. So what I'm going to tell you about now is something that's emerged from that called responsible handover. Responsible handover is thinking about the governance space that exists when any tool passes from one hand to another. And I'm going to come on in a minute to look at why this is a particular problem in the tech world. But first, I think just to say that where this comes is in this space that's created by what I'm calling the round table problem, which is there is a realization that the implications of rolling out AI could be really profound for society. They could disrupt huge systems from banking to clinical medicine, that it has the capacity to do things that we didn't expect, that we have all kinds of risks of harm associated with applying tools in the wrong context. And we're already, if we stick with the theme of health that I'm talking about today, we're already seeing examples where, applications that are diagnostics to detect cancers of the skin have been tested predominantly on white skin and don't show up the same things on black skin. We're seeing autonomous surgery that has been developed for people for a certain kind of range of body types accidentally being used on obese people where the body type's not fitting with what the surgery is expecting. And so we're seeing all kinds of actual bodily harm as a result of people not understanding the context in which they can deploy tools. So there's a rush for regulation when we talk about these things. There's a sort of a push, an urge for some sort of regulation, some sort of way of getting hold of it. And then as soon as people look at the complexity of what that regulation would be expected to achieve, they pull back because, of course, what would work for autonomous warfare would not be a suitable set of questions and hurdles and barriers to apply in healthcare. And so because of that complexity, because of the inability to find a set of questions that would be static in time, but that would be flexible enough to bend to all of the new things that are being developed every single day, whether that's an AI to determine how to house new immigrants, or whether it's an AI to determine what the mood of the market is for the finance sector. These things are changing all the time. And the impossibility of that task sends everybody back to the round table to have yet another discussion about ethics. And we just go round and round this circle. And in the meantime, there is a big practical gap in the middle, which is all these tools and tech are being handed over. They're being handed over in organizations from one to another, from a mathematician to a software developer to somebody who's, say, client facing. To the client. The client is then handing it into people who are involved in some sort of practice. Practice is handing it on to, or using it in a context which involves communities and different users of that service. And so we're seeing all these places where this is happening in an ungoverned fashion. And people are not recognizing that these are all points at which we potentially lose vital information And I'm going to take you through very briefly today, and at great speed today, the development of what we're called responsible handover that's emerged from us developing this and testing it in the clinical setting, or I should say in biomedical research, right from the very beginning of exploratory research all the way through to working with, for example, Caprissa in South Africa, which is the HIV centres, looking at people who are much more patient-facing or community facing, who are trying to use these tools and tech or systems that are based upon them. So we've taken this and tested it through this system, and that's what I'm sharing with you today. So here what we have is a pretty obvious description of the information lost and the reasons why it matters. And in particular, things like what requirements might be needed, and what would make it actually useful for people. I draw attention to that because this is what actually threatens to widen the equity in things like healthcare and biomedicine. Instead of closing that gap, it's actually causing it to widen, because people who should be able to pick up tools that don't require them to have great big infrastructure instead cannot, because they cannot quality assure them, and they cannot understand what the safety issues and the implications are, because it's not clear to them how these were developed. So each point this is lost. And I'm saying this is a particular problem for data science. And I think it's a cultural thing. I think we have this sort of tech bro type of culture where things slide from hand to hand, beta versions are in circulation, so updates get made. It's all very casual, and because it's very casual, it's also casual about governance. And so I'm just trying to move to the next slide there. Can we move me along? Thank you. So we looked at all these places where handovers are happening, but people are not necessarily recognizing them as such. And this is just a very brief list of the types of handovers that we were looking at. But bear in mind, we started with research here. So this is something that focuses quite a lot on research from the very start, researcher going out to endpoint of clinical practice. And this is the kind of description that people gave us working on some of the major platforms for clinical research. It's getting to the point where it's becoming reckless. And many people that we spoke to were very concerned that they were trying to do the right thing. They didn't know what the right thing was in terms of the release of models, software, and applications, products, and sharing of those, whether that was on GitHub or whether it's actually, marketing and sharing a final product. And so we were looking for how to approach this situation, and what we did is we borrowed from other parts of engineering. Well, we couldn't quite believe that this hadn't happened actually in the area of AI. So the good news is that in other parts of engineering, there is a very established way of getting across that bridge between, sort of worrying about the complexity of regulation or over-regulating, and the roundtable discussion where we just keep signing up to the same principles, but we don't ever kind of close that gap. There is a very good way of getting across, and that is to have frameworks that can be mandated because they are high enough level to be applicable to everybody and to be flexible, but they are actually adaptable because they are not over prescriptive. So what we sought to do was to go as far as it was possible to go with a framework that asks questions at a generic enough level to be more or less applicable to everyone, at least in terms of the kind of governing meaning of the questions, and to take that as far as it was possible to go, and to test, was that as far as it was possible to go? Was it useful to people in quite a wide range of settings? And so whilst to many of you on this call who perhaps aren't from a research background, this will seem like it's all about biomedical research, but actually what we enabled us to do is to pick something that has a really diverse set of settings, which is to say exploratory research, you would never want to put on exploratory research the kind of stringent requirements that should be needed at the level of clinical procurement. So you've got a very long and different type of setting there, as well as obviously different domains and so on. So it's a very useful place to test that flexibility. Is this something that could be used? Because if it is, if you can come up with a framework that everyone can adopt, can become universal, it becomes possible for people to anticipate the issues that they should be addressing right from the development stage. But it also just means that it can be mandated. You can ask people to follow a responsible handover approach in the same way that you would ask them to follow a standard health and safety approach. The health and safety questions that you would ask in a factory producing food might be different from the health and safety questions that you would ask in a farming situation. But they are broadly governed by the same questions. They just have, adaptations on them, and everyone in those fields is responsible for working out what those adaptations should be. That's the approach. It's the approach where, if you look at other parts of engineering, civil engineering, if I build a bridge, the process of handing that bridge over to the transport authority is probably just as complex as building the bridge, because I have to make sure that I understood how much traffic that transport authority expected to go over the bridge. The transport authority has to make sure that I understood that they want to put 40 trucks an hour over the bridge. We have to share information about what kind of tests were done, what kind of strain can be taken, what to look for in terms of monitoring of safety failures and all of that. So there's so much that we would have to share. That is the handover. It's expected, and it's a professionalized approach in other parts of engineering. It's just not happening in software. And so this is what we sought to achieve. And what we've come up with is something that's like that, but actually is a conversation, because what we didn't want to do is just simply create a checklist or a toolbox. What we wanted to emphasize was that this is a conversation. It's a conversation in which the person proposing a tool needs to take on board the considerations of who it is that might pick up and use that tool, and what might their limitations be. In other words, I cannot be someone following responsible handover if I am presenting a tool or a model or a bit of kit to somebody I know does not have the technical skills necessary. I cannot be responsible if I've calibrated my diagnostic tool on a Philips machine and I know that they only have GE and I haven't actually got anything to say about its error rate in response to that unless I explain that point. Right? I cannot be responsible if I can't explain where my data has come from, and to have a think about how the data, how that might influence its relevance to the problem that the tool adopter is trying to solve. So the first question, of course, of the framework is, what problem does it address, to make sure we're on the same page and we can start considering where there might be limitations in the tool that I've developed that make it not suitable to be plugged in to the problem that the tool adopter has. So this is a two-way conversation, and it's scripted as such. It's known as script in engineering, and it's written out as a script with levels. And these are all questions, as I say, which have been tested. And I can share with you, I'm sure Sam's going to share in the chat shortly, the full framework. It's only just slightly over 1 page of standard text. So it's actually very approachable for people who are in a low code or a no code environment, or people who are put off asking these questions, or clinical directors in hospitals who have backed away from asking these questions because they don't know, well, is this all the questions I should ask? How do I make sure my team know what they're doing with these questions? It enables people to see at a glance. This is pretty much everything you need to cover in the responsible handover at all. Doesn't mean that they're not more detailed questions that you should have. You might have in, let's say, clinical practice, you might have a go, no go. You might decide that this question, unless it can be answered, in the affirmative or fully, it's documentation, then it doesn't progress any further. Or unless A/B testing's been done, it doesn't progress any further. But in other areas, for example, if you're another researcher just picking up someone else's bit of modeling and wanting to play around with it, then of course that wouldn't be a go, no go situation. So it enables all of that in the way that it's designed. And I just want to draw attention to the layering of it, which is, it's also layered so that if you don't understand or don't see the relevance of a question, you can go back to the root question and understand what was intended by that and figure out what it might be in your sector, what it might mean for you. I've already covered how it's been developed, and these are the places where it's been tested around the world. I'm just going to share with you a few bits and pieces from the people who've been testing it. So Asia Murray shared the experience on something called DigiCat, which is developed to find treatments for mental health, and use the case study, use their own experience of trying to create user guidance as a test of the framework. As she's pointed out, these are her slides. As she's pointed out, it was an asynchronous handover, i.e., it doesn't actually happen as a conversation, although we've modeled it as such. It happens as you produce the information that goes forward with the tool for other people to pick up. And their observation was that it really helps with good practice, what's going on everywhere. I think this is worth people understanding that a lot of bad practice happens by accident. It doesn't happen because people set out to do things badly. It happens because everybody everywhere is trying to actually figure out what the questions are, and it might be hit and miss. So as Asia pointed out, in their team, they ended up having to contact lots of people, friends and other researchers, and say, well, what kind of things should we be doing here? What kind of information should we be including? Because no one's guiding us in doing this. How inefficient is that? Asking every single developer and researcher to actually come up with what should be the good governance practice for providing a tool and handing it on or up through a repository or through a product. That's a ludicrous way of going about things, and all those people who worry about things like researcher burden and innovation should be thinking about this incredibly inefficient situation that's created by a governance gap where people are having to all make it up and figure it out for themselves. We had a great case study from Steve Bikosaigu from the African population. It's actually the African Population Research, Health Research Centre in Kenya. They provide a platform which people can access various tools for population health research and interventions, and it's just a few of the different subject areas that they cover. It's huge. And they provide it for largely for a lot of low code and no code users. So they have ways in which people can access and use some of the tools that are available, even if they don't have their software writing skills that others have. And their view or their experience, they tested it on their IDARE no code platform. And their insight was it gave them clear expectations from the onset about what they should be handing over at the end of maybe a long research project. And it gave them an opportunity to test compliance with the framework. And they were looking for something which would be help them to make sure their software was long-term and sustainable, because of course that's the other thing, that if you haven't handed it over properly, then it's not possible for it to be updated and developed properly either. So their observation was also that by following a good governance framework, by following a good governance practice, they also were enabled to upskill people in their team. So it wasn't just left to one person to sort of to handle this. It meant that the whole team had to become aware of things like the societal implications of what you're doing, whether or not you are using data that you should be using, whether or not you have that available and you can clearly explain it. All those questions, it enabled them to make sure these were shared across a team, which was something we hadn't thought about at the start as one of our criteria. I'm briefly going to take you through Bettina Moltrecht, which is Harmony. Harmony is a is basically designed to bring together different databases from survey data, so that it's possible to look at mental health and population mental health and combine different survey data in order to do that. And of course, that's dealing with the fact that many different surveys that go on around the world, but they're all using different types of terminology and different range of questions. So by bringing those data together, they could actually make far more powerful insight into that material. For example, she highlights the way that some of them trouble relaxing and unable to relax may not be recognized as the same thing, but they actually, what they do is they you can put your questions in and they score how well. So using the AI, they score how well the questions match. So whether or not you can bring those data together and actually say that they were both asking the same question, for example. And their insight into it was that they were already incredibly thoughtful about the users and the implications of what they were doing. Although they did say that one of the things that they hadn't thought about was the potential for misuse, which the framework enabled them to think about afterwards. But what they were really concerned about was that they went through the guidance and they thought about it and they came up with similar lists to what is in the framework. They then applied the framework and sort of filled in a few gaps. They thought afterwards, it's like, what if we hadn't documented or shared our code and had not engaged with users and thought about all of the ways in which their work could be misused, the tool could be misused? It's quite shocking that it's possible that such a thing could happen. And that there isn't governance as standard. So effectively, we shouldn't be relying, is what they're saying, Bettina's saying, we shouldn't just be relying on the fact that you have a couple of people in the team who are very mindful. It should be more than that. And finally, a case study from Guy's and St Thomas's Hospital, which I'm going to really rush through so we have plenty of time for discussion at the end, which is that they have their own quality management system now, and they've been really pioneers in the field of thinking about how to adopt responsibly AI into clinical settings. They've got their own multidisciplinary team, and they use what they're seeing as gaps in the clinical provision to come up with software solutions. What I found them had they have a very good way of thinking about the kind of material that they're picking up from research, which is technology readiness levels. I don't know if other people are familiar with this, but it's actually a very helpful way of a bit of a cold shower, really, for a lot of researchers, because what they can then see is that a heck of a lot of what they're doing is not anywhere near this level of system proved to work and so on, but is actually a much lower level and coming to people in clinical practice or people developing clinical solutions with none of the kind of supporting information that's required to actually make use of it, to the point where, as Anil pointed out, sometimes you see what people have done and you realize that actually, in order to be responsible, you might as well just go and do it yourself and repeat it and completely waste that research, utterly pointless, because it doesn't have the kind of information that he's listed here, the kind of information you need to be able to make use of it reliably. So there's so much research waste that's going on, that's people are imagining, they talk about impact in their research, they're actually imagining that they're producing something that people can pick up and use, and they really can't if they want to be responsible or if they're in a clinical setting. So I'm going to just look at the way that he's mapped some of this onto the framework and shown that there are all of these quality systems that exist in organizations where the framework actually complies. And this is really helpful for us, really good piece of work. I'm showing it to you more as a quality assurance of the framework to show you that he's done the careful work of seeing that the framework's compliant with all of the other requirements that they exist around clinical settings. So this is an interesting way of doing a case study. They looked at why their handovers had failed, why it was impossible for them to pick up and use research or to use other people's products or things that people lobbed into the hospital. It didn't integrate with current software. Um, that it was AI that was optimized for reducing false positive diagnoses, but downstream it was more risk of missing patients. Things that actually meant that they couldn't use the sorts of tools that researchers had thought that they were developing for clinical practice, but because there isn't a common governance framework, turns out not to be something they could pick up. So I'm going to jump over this. So where next? So first of all, where next for research? And I really appreciate the patience of those of you who I know are social agitators and you know, really thinking hard about the democratic and decision-making implications of this, for staying with the clinical side of this, because, but have patience a little more because we're coming to it. The guidance for researchers is needed to roll this out. We need adoption across funders and investors as a universal high-level approach, and we need funding to shift to being sustainable software and stewardship. Too much, everyone wants to fund new stuff, right? Instead of actually making things that are being discovered actually usable, reusable, and responsible. We've got things which are just wasted and over again, and everyone's still looking for exploratory new stuff. You know, there are AIs that are potentially very beneficial to sharing the profits of our society with more people, and yet no one's able to pick them up because they haven't been developed with the stewardship that's needed. So funders need to have a really good look at what does it mean, and investors, what does it mean to fund and invest responsibly in this area. And finally, in research, data donation is something we hadn't picked up before the framework, but realised that many low code and no code environments around the world are seen as just recipients of tools and tech. And of course they are, because they don't have the computing power to actually develop and test these things themselves. So they're very dependent on people coming with a good quality manual of what they're talking about and good transparency about what they're sharing. But what is also the case is that they need to be seen as potentially data contributors as well. So we have AIs which are developing based solely on the data inputs from countries and regions that do not benefit the countries and regions where these products are being sold in or pushed in. And we need to be incredibly mindful of that and actually have a much more explicit conversation about data donation and how relevant data is used to maintain tools. Jump to the next. So where next for policy and society? What we plan to do, so we're going to agitate for all of that in the research infrastructure, and we are in the research ecosystem, and we have lots of people already playing with us to do that. We have a lot of collaboration emerging out of the launch of the Responsible Handover Framework just 3 weeks ago. I'm delighted to say that major funders are taking it on board, that we've got a lot of integration going on with other frameworks and ethical guidelines. But where we're going to go with this, more generally at Sense About Science, is to raise the heat on policy pressure to mandate responsible handover. So that's something I'm really keen to talk about. And I think we have to perhaps be willing to talk a little bit more in the language of people who are making policy decisions and politicians, which is the language of innovation. And to point out that actually what's going on is wasted opportunities for improving people's lot in all sorts of ways, because of the lack of responsible governance that goes on as things have passed from hand to hand. But I think we should be looking for pressure to mandate responsible handover, and certainly in key areas of procurement and commissioning. So particularly in any kind of decision-making role in government and systems and services. And as many people know, things like deciding who's a fraudster or deciding who gets welfare and those kinds of things are already things which are being highly automated, and all kinds of assumptions being made. We are going to be looking to increase awareness and public backing. I think we finally have something we can ask the public to get behind, because it's so difficult to make AI tangible to people. And I'm sure everyone on this call has found that. But I think here we have something that we can actually start to find ways, find avenues where we can ask for different sections of the public to back a call, whether that's in a sort of maybe more esoteric setting, such as research and asking for funders to back this and to join up with it, or whether it's more broadly asking consumers to do it, or people to actually push for it in relation to being adopted in certain circumstances, like, as I say, local services and provision. Integrating with other quality management and governance, that's something that is going underway, somewhat technical for Sense About Science, but we're keen to collaborate to see that happen, because in a sense that's a bit more of a grassroots push out of this. We've got work with engineers worldwide to push out standards and to see people starting to adopt this in practice. And finally, a platform to develop and share applied versions. So these last two are the more sort of like, what's the infrastructure that's needed? And I'm delighted that there's already collaboration underway in those. And the first two are the policy and public campaigning side, which I think are incredibly important. And I'm really excited that we have a practical outcome. And just say finally, as a campaigner of 20 years, and obviously I didn't mention at the beginning, All Trials is one of the most globally successful campaigns. We changed laws, we changed practices. We're now at something like 97% of trials in Europe. Many medicines providers have now been published. We changed the European law, we changed FDA, and many other areas too. And the great thing about that was that we had that great combination of people understanding what's at stake in terms of the big principles and safety and transparency, but also some practical things to call for that we could align. We could fix that frustration and that call to a particular outcome. And I think this is the Responsible Handover Framework is the start of that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Tracy. Wow, there's so much there. Got lots of questions already coming in. I mean, I've got those questions, but it's so great to see, I guess, just that collaboration. And then, you know, with other groups, like I said, there's a bit of a grassroots campaign and that cross-referencing. I mean, I had the pleasure and privilege to see you present this live, and I saw, you know, those case studies, the people present that live and cross-reference the other standards to the framework. And yeah, and you shared the framework there. Did you say Sam might share a link to the fuller framework in the chat, and we can also follow up with an email to all RSVPs and attendees for the session. But there's some questions in the chat, so maybe I'll go to those. But you know, yeah, it's also just really exciting to see how it's progressed, and with the lobbying or with the raising public awareness, you know, maybe that's something Anti-Party can help with. But it sounds like with the All Trials campaign, you don't need any help doing that whatsoever. So we have a sort of more general question, maybe a clarification point from Josh here about is the proposal overall, you know, kind of more aiming to speed up adoption of new technologies, or is the goal primarily safety, if you had to choose?
First of all, I just want to say we definitely do need help. And I think the more that people will put their shoulder to the wheel of public campaigning, the better. So Isabella, that's brilliant. I'd love you to work on that with us. It's neither of those things, actually. It's empowerment. So it's just keeping decision making in the hands of people who are actually providing their services and receiving services, or who are you know, people are actually being able to see what it is they're getting and understand the strengths and weaknesses, and if necessary, if they're a kind of cog in the machine, to pass that on, and so that we end up in a situation where it becomes normal to ask all these sorts of questions. So it's largely that. And I think, you know, in some settings you can see that yes, fast adoption would be great if you've got something which could get over the fact that, stick with healthcare, that in some regions of the world, people are never going to have access to great diagnostics in terms of all the big bits of kit that they need. And if there are some AI tools that would enable them to get similar kinds of diagnostic results as we can get in, say, Massachusetts General Hospital, then fantastic. Then adoption is an issue. We want to see the fruits of that shared properly. But
Understood.
also, and particularly also, I think when people's data has been used to develop a tool, I think they should see some benefit come back to them for it. But in other areas, no adoption, because you've got people misusing things. You've got, for example, I'm sticking always clinical examples here because I think it just paints the picture so clearly, but you can find equivalents in all sectors. You've got situations where something that has relevance in a research setting, such as one of the mental health tools I talked about, really would be harmful if it was just adopted in a sort of clumsy way into, say, a consumer app. As much as we're seeing now with things like diabetes tools and so on, it's like, where's the line between something which actually has clinical benefit and something which is a bit of a kind of consumer, sort of an extension of your, how many steps did I do today, type application. And so in those sorts of situations, you think, well, okay, we'd actually want some sort of blocker on people thinking they get a medical diagnosis when they're not.
Absolutely, yeah. And then that point around, use of our personal data and whether we can ever benefit from that, that's a big ongoing topic. Even this morning, speaking about with the AI Democracy group, if anyone wants to join that WhatsApp group, it's the links in the chat. And then there's just a comment here from Joy. I work in the Department for Science, Innovation and Tech on the Algorithmic Transparency Recording Standards, ATRS. Keen to understand overlaps on this and other areas of our work. Perhaps a further conversation would be useful. So I'm sure Joy will be following up with you there on that. And there's a question from Fiona as well. I think there needs to be an aspect of the handover which delivers an action plan for any and all victims, as we've seen recently with the Tainted Bloods inquiry, and has been demonstrated in other examples by all trials. Healthcare lacks speedy mechanisms for delivering support as opposed to cover-ups for victims. Could a pathway be devised to acknowledge that?
I think there's definitely a bit more. So one of the places where we have left things, for quite a lot of determination, so that we didn't fix on the framework something that was only suited to one part of a sector, is on the whole question of responsibility, which includes actually also ownership as well. So it's kind of connected, isn't it, to liability and so on. So I think there does need to be a piece of work to look at that in more detail and to perhaps provide some supplementary material around the questions that, or at least some applied versions and the worked examples. So we're gonna really pull this to life through worked examples in some sectors. And I think that's a really, really important point. And that's obviously one consequence of not clarifying that is, where do you go and when where there's a temptation to evade accountability for decision making. And that's the other thing in healthcare, of course, in some ways you benefit from the fact that clinicians have an understanding that they are responsible for the decisions that they're making, and there is some established responsibility there. Whereas when you start to get into grayer areas where people are using apps and so on, and maybe even just through habit, this is going to change, that it just weakens that sense of, did the computer say no, or did the clinician, or did was there a mistake in the system or not? Can I just say the other thing as well that I think we have to get across the public is that is the lack of distributed knowledge in our society on this. There's nothing else. I can't come across anything else where we have an area of technology and so few people relative to the speed of adoption, so few people who are able to ask about it. And if you think about this for a moment, you think about something like, say, nuclear power. Right. I know that my mum could probably conjure up about 4 or 5 questions on how safe is nuclear power. She'd probably manage to think of something like, does it overheat? What happens if there's an explosion? Does the radiation stay in the atmosphere or in the soil or whatever? She'd have some sense of like being able to ask something about it. When you say to people AI, will it take over the world? Or jokingly, people will say, and that's it. That tells you just how how poorly distributed the knowledge is in our society.
Mhm.
And when you think of that speed at which it's being rolled out, which is far surpasses other forms of technology, it's incredible. And so we have to cover this with a governance gap. We have to cover this governance gap really fast. And this is one way to speak to that. But I do think the public needs to be made aware that that's the case. And perhaps the second thing I'd say, I'm sorry to grab the floor again, Isabella, but the other thing is, I would say, is that the safety mechanism that we have now is kind of try and see, you know, which is to say, sort of picking up that question about who's liable when something goes wrong. You know, you're relying on the person who wrote the software to have thought of the parameters in such a way that bad things won't happen.
Or
And how
the
do you
unknown
find out whether they
unknowns.
did or they didn't when it goes wrong?
Right.
Or when it doesn't do what it's supposed to do?
Yeah.
And
And there's a difference between like frameworks, principles, and regulation. But generally, with regulation, it always tends to happen after a crisis or after something bad happens, right? And whether that's in the finance industry or various health regulations after certain scandals. So with something like this, it's kind of, you know, we can't risk anything going wrong in the first instance because we can't always recover as well from it. And then
yeah.
plus you get the reputational damage. But no, that's super interesting. And I mean, if there's a previous slide or in the framework itself where we can just pinpoint the areas of the handover framework where it addresses these issues or these like sort of global governance potentially AI issues, that'd be really helpful. So we've got a few more questions coming through. Just one from Adam, like, are you considering whether this could be adopted as an ISO quality management standard? And then there's quite a long comment and potentially question from Kirsten, which I haven't proofread first, but Kirsten says, I work in R&D governance and Guy's and St. Thomas NHS Foundation Trust. Was really interested to hear where this would go, as I felt like the first few slides about the context didn't represent what I experienced daily working in medical research governance. I feel the review I'm used to putting AI tools through before use in device trials is really thorough, with input from specialist teams and really robust governance requirements with plenty of ongoing monitoring. Hadn't realized that one of our data engineers helped come up with this framework and was a case study. So I think she's referring to, you'll know his name, I think. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. Looking forward to hearing from the MHRA soon on their updates on AI as a medical device, which will be really relevant and worth incorporating into this framework. Thank you. Interesting talk with lots of important applications in other sectors too.
Well, if Guy can actually, Guy's and St. Thomas's is the answer to both of those questions. Actually, the first is that Guy's and St. Thomas's is streets ahead of everyone else and has been agitating in other settings for ages now to say that there should be standard training, there should be frameworks adopted, and now has developed its own quality management system, which from next June, I'm delighted to say, I'm sharing all your good news, Kirsty, I'm sorry, but it's going to be sharing that with other hospital settings. So that's fantastic and it's very generous. Unfortunately, they're not nearly as well supported as they should be. I think they should be having a very large part of NHS budget, but they're not. They have done this mostly on shoestrings of, you know, in terms of setting out the framework and helping others to go through it. They do that, you know, in a very generous way. So I think, yeah, Guy's and St. Thomas's is streets ahead. And when you start going to other countries, they are really streets ahead. ISO, yeah, but ISO is a kind of institutional system, which is kind of what I was talking about there with Guys. You know, that's about having a whole institution system where you audit whether or not everything from your kind of customer communications or your user communications to your procurement of materials or employee training, that you put all the whole thing together. So the framework would fit into that very well in terms of being a very good way. If you say that we are a responsible organization that hands over tools and tech or adopts tools and tech responsibly, using the framework would be one piece of evidence as to how you do that. You would also need to be training your people and so on. So yeah, there is it fits quite well. In fact, Anil from Guys actually is the person who showed me how it maps really well to the various ISOs. Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, that's so good. That's great to hear, and great to hear all the good news as well. So for the remaining time that we have, if anyone has any more questions, I mean, you know, if anyone can see how this relates to the work they're doing or interest they have, or if they've got direct experience, say with the FAIR principles that was mentioned in there as well, just let us know in the chat. And then, yeah, and I don't know, Tracy, maybe if you just give us a sense of, and I think I got this in the live presentation, of just how much the process of getting it to where it is now, and like how long that's taken, how many people were involved. I don't know if you just want to give us a bit more of a sense of just the journey to get to where we are right now. That'd be really
Well,
interesting.
I have to say it's huge generosity of people's time, because to test this. And the four examples I gave you there were among many that we consulted on, and we got people to pick it up and run with it and give us input. Those are four that very kindly drew some slides together for the launch, which meant I could steal those slides. But there were others too. It would be really interesting, perhaps, for you to see how people sort of more in the front line of research application, like the HIV Centre, Caprissa, how they felt about it. The thing that I would say is that I am absolutely bowled over by how open and forward-looking and quick everyone is that's coming into contact with this, adopting it and thinking of ways that they can integrate it. So we've had meetings, well, just they're coming out our ears and we're struggling to keep up with them, actually. But I am really excited about how open and quick. I mean, when compare it to all trials, when we had to, with even some of the Royal Colleges of Medicine, we had to really push through. And my goodness, when that launched in the States, the attitude from some of the senior people in places like Yale and so on, the idea that we've got this, leave it to the adults, is the kind of attitude that was coming across from the medics, was really disappointing and really frustrating. And in fact, I would say although we had horrible times then, when we had, like 300 pharmaceutical lobbyists in the European Parliament trying to shoot down the amendments to the European Medicines Directive. On the other hand, the hardest thing was that we had people kind of on our own side who were incredibly damaging of the All Trials campaign, and made it sound as though we were going to kind of stop medical innovation in its tracks by asking for research to be published.
Wow.
So that was very hard. I would say there's a real contrast here, is that there are a lot of people who are immediately offering, how do we bring this forward? How can we make this integrate with our systems? We're having great conversations with Turing and with all sorts of organizations around the world. We're having an Australian launch, which I think kind of various agencies in Australia are almost putting together themselves by just taking an interest. So it's moving faster than we can cope with, for sure, in terms of people picking it up and running with it and making it their own. So that I would share that piece of positive news.
Yeah, wow. No, that's incredible. And it's great that, you can obviously compare to the journey or the challenges you might have faced with the All Trials campaign and cause. And it's great to hear that generally there's this culture of sort of collaboration, cooperation, rather than say competition, because everyone acknowledges that this is for the greater good, or there's a bigger picture here that we all will benefit from. There's a few more questions in the chat, but I just had I guess a follow-on question from what you just shared about when people go off and run with it, sort of sometimes, like, say, managing that application, or the sort of the correct application of that, and I mean, maybe similarly with things like anti-party or certain ideas or ideologies or use cases. How much can you actually really control or manage once people start going off, and is it out of your control?
You can't. It's and I think that for us, remember, we actually sat in the office together going, right, okay, we're going to take the approach that the perfect is the enemy of the good on this. We're going to accept the fact that people might badge themselves up to say we use responsible handover and have something that doesn't look half as good as it should be. We'll take that, actually, because if everybody starts talking about the need for responsible governance, we can iron out what good looks like in more detail through practice and audit and those things later on. But right now, I think the urgency is there, that seeking for perfect and anticipating every possible hiccup or misuse or whatever is, sort of, or overstatement of how responsible something is. I think we can live with it.
Very interesting. Yeah, absolutely. And there's that whole, rate of adoption, and then there's the, stages of refining and professionalizing that, isn't there? So yeah, it's good to know that, with the context of where we are in this journey. just sharing a few more comments. I know we're just a minute over time, so thank you everyone for your attention and engagement today. Adam just had a quick question around, what other applications could this be used? And I guess that's why, we're here today with the UK Democracy Network and Anti-Party about, the use of AI, its adoption in AI. And Fiona just had a quick comment around public awareness. We will be discussing the potential of the applicability of this model. I like the idea that it's an H&S matter, health and safety matter, to the music creative industries at the next Musicians Union EDI committee, with a view to bringing a motion in support of the responsible handover model to the TUC conference, where concerns have already been raised.
That's very nice to hear. I'm just looking at my colleague. That's really nice to hear. That's fantastic. How exciting.
Yeah.
I tell you what, actually, Isabella, I think there's a few other comments there as well. So if you're able to share the chat with us afterwards and any questions that we haven't picked up or any ideas that people have suggested, we'd be really happy to pick those up and collaborate and connect. So yeah,
Right.
please do
Thank
share
you so
that chat
much
with us.
Yeah, we'll do. And everyone will be sent the recording and the follow-up links for the framework, and to get in touch with the team at Sense About Science. And thank you so much, Tracy, for sharing all your insights and for doing all this work, you and the team. Thank you so much for being here with us today. I think everyone's learned so much and feeling really inspired. So thank you. And thanks everyone for joining, and
thank you.
Enjoy the rest of your day. Speak soon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.